Hey, fellow Africans and South Africans, regardless of colour. I'm putting this video together because, these self-serving ANC and EFF guys need to realise one truth. And I'm talking to Malema as well, because he's a complete arsehole. Okay. Before the African tribes came into Kwazulu Natal because the pastures were great and they could graze their cattle there, there were people there before them. They were called the Khoi Khoi and they were called the San. So if you look at north of Mozambique, or south of Mozambique I should say, going down the Kwazulu Natal area, that was pre-inhabited by Khoi Khoi and San. And what the Zulus did to those people is absolutely shocking. The San and the Khoi Khoi were totally exterminated. Not just wiped out, they were exterminated by tribes like the Zulu. And the only place that the San found any refuge were high up in the Drakensberg on the east side of Lesotho. And there you can see the paintings that they put up in caves and things like that at the time. And in fact, there's an interesting point here. And again, this is just getting history correct. I talked earlier in my video about the Griqua people who first moved out of the Cape because the Dutch were embarrassed that their offspring were coloured, so they were kind of forced out. And they moved right up north to Griquatown. And then because the missionaries came in and they found this issue with dealing with the missionaries, they moved east towards the Orange Free State where they settled. And then I talked about how the Boers came through and they were kicked off their land, and they went through Lesotho and over the Ongeluksnek, which was a horrific experience for the Griqua. And they landed up in East Griqualand. Now, why is this relevant to what we're talking about? Because the area they moved into was called No Man's Land. And there were two reasons it was No Man's Land. One was because the Zulu from the north had come in and they'd pretty well exterminated most of the Africans who lived there, except for people like the Xhosa who went further south, and the Pondos who went towards the coast. So they all moved out of that area, leaving what was called, in the 1850s, No Man's Land. And it was because it was No Man's Land the Griqua were granted that territory to move into. Now, key point here is that the African tribes like the Zulu, the Xhosa, the Pondos, all these different tribes actually exterminated the Khoi Khoi and the San to take their lands in KwaZulu Natal. They preceded these Africans. Okay, so this argument that the whites came in and kind of kicked the Africans off is bullshit. It's bullshit. It's that simple. Now let's move on. What is happening now in South Africa is incredibly sad. I've been to South Africa several times in the last 10 years, many times. Some to do with the launching of my book, but others not. And what I've noticed, I'm going to just give you a few examples, and there are so many of them. I'll start off with Griquatown, where there's a museum called the Mary Moffat Museum. And the curator there for 30 years was a wonderful old farm wife whose name was Hetta Hager. and she really looked after that museum. And when she hit retirement age, this is after 30 years of working there, she was told she wasn't wanted. And you know who they put in her place as the curator of that museum? The African woman who cleaned the museum. Listen to this. They put in her place the woman who cleaned the museum as the curator of the Mary Moffat Museum in Grikwa. Just get your head around that, okay? Now, no expertise. She's a cleaner, and now she's running the Mary Moffat Museum in Grikwa. But it gets worse. You look at Kuruman, you know, where the Moffats had their amazing mission. That is now run by Africans, and just in 6 years, between 2006 and when I went back there in 2012, the place had just gone. An African curator who didn't know what he was doing, and in fact, when I walked around the place, there were a whole lot of stuff, and I put some links down below so you can see this. There was a whole lot of stuff that had been stolen since he had been put in there. Now, that is an extraordinary, significant museum, not just for the white people, but for the African people. And yet they don't care. They really don't care. When I went to Bloemfontein, I suggest anyone who goes through Bloemfontein go down that historic lane where you've got the first parliament, or the first government house that was ever set up. And that is probably the only historic building in Bloemfontein which is still maintained correctly. And it's because there's a white curator, or there was. Maybe there isn't anymore, I don't know. But, you know, the state buildings, you go in those buildings, which are historic buildings, and you'll find that most of the cabinets are empty. All the stuff has been stolen. This is the history of South Africa. Whether it's right or wrong is irrelevant, but what is happening is these black curators are allowing things to be stolen, and God knows if they're profiting from them. I'm not saying they are, but I'd suggest as a huge suggestion they are. And they don't care, because the Africans don't care about pre-1994 history, which includes what the Zulus and other tribes did to the Khoi Khoi and the San in Kwazulu Natal. And we're talking about a long, long time ago when they first moved in there. They exterminated them. But of course, that is not relevant today, is it? But let's move on a bit. If we look at Pretoria, I suggest anyone who lives in Gauteng and a stone's throw from Pretoria, that they go to the Paul Kruger house. And what you'll find is that, well, this is what I found a few years ago. Maybe everything's been stolen now. But what you'll find is that most of the crockery has disappeared. There's no one supervising the place. You know, they don't care. And you've got when I was there, you've got a black African, who's in charge, and he doesn't move from his desk. He's not interested. You know, you can go through, and everything's within reaching distance, so you can take what you like. And that's what's been happening at Paul Kruger's house in Pretoria. The Voortrekker Monument, when I was there a few years ago now, it still looked amazing. Okay, you had white curators, and it was treated with respect as a historic monument. But there are so many more examples of this. I know in Cape Town, the museum there is still good, because Cape Town tends to be a very white-governed area, so they look after their history. But if you look at Port Shepstone had a museum, a very, very important museum. The white curator was thrown out, and they put the bloody cleaner in there as well. as the curator. Now, that is what's happening to the archives of South African history. It's been destroyed. It's been absolutely destroyed. And they are so short-sighted, and I'm talking about the South African government, that they don't think about their own sins and what their tribes did when they came into KwaZulu Natal and totally exterminated any San and Khoi Khoi, or Bushmen and Hottentots who lived in that area. Exterminated them without any pity at all. You know, it's interesting because what the white man brought to South Africa was health, education, government, and democracy. And for this, they've been treated like a piece of shit.